happy to be able to present it to this audience, because I know that I saw the great lab you guys have built, and yeah, and the projects you're working on. So yeah, it's really great to keep this interaction going also for the future, and I hope this is an opportunity to establish even closer relationship. So yeah, as thank you. As Anna was mentioning, this we've been working on this project by now, like 2 or 3 years ago, and by now is probably a bit updated with respect to what you have seen, Anna. But yeah, we were also like, I mean, we got the idea of working on this because we were interested in general in this debate that was emerging about the effect of automation on the labor market. And so since there is in general like growing concern among workers around the world about machines possibly replacing jobs, and a lively debate on the labor market effects of automation in the academy, and you know, this debate is far from conclusive, in the sense that for the US, some researchers find a very negative effect, especially for an earlier period, on both employment and wages in the US. And so, just to give you an idea, a seismograph report find that one extra robot reduces employment by around 6 jobs for a period that goes between 1990s and 2007, and before the Great Recession, and also that wages reduced for almost all groups in the labor market as a result of automation. In Europe, other works find, especially for Germany, like no aggregate effects on employment. But this null effect of automation on employment still conceals like a lot of changes in the labor market. In particular, it's shown that the zero effect is the result of a very negative effect on manufacturing jobs, and a positive and very positive effect on the creation in more like service type of jobs, even within the same firms. So there was a movement of jobs from standard manufacturing stable jobs to more managerial type of jobs within the company, or also an increase in jobs in other sectors other than manufacturing, which is the service, more in the service sectors. So this idea, I mean, it's clear that no matter whether we believe ultimately that automation is bad or good for the overall economy, there has been a lot of changes and transitions of people from jobs of a certain kind to new type of jobs. So we thought that there must have been also like important effects on the life and on important life decisions of people if all of this transition is happening. And so we thought that there is very little that we know about how these technological changes have been reshaping life course choices. And you know, like we thought, why not? Because why not focusing on this question? Because there is a lot of literature on the effect of technological change in general on family behavior, right? Like very different types of technological change. So, for instance, like progress in women's contraceptive technology has triggered the second demographic transition, or you know, the progress in household technologies between the 30s and the 50s have changed the bargaining power within the family. Progress in health, in medical technologies and the health of mothers and infants have also allowed women to increase their total fertility rate, and also to increase their labor force participation. And finally, There is more recent work showing that the digital revolution, in particular the expansion of broadband, has allowed especially high education women to reconcile better their labor force participation with their family involvement. And so in this type of framework or literature, like our idea is that we want to look at this other type of technology, how the exposure to this type of technology on the labor market, in this case, so robots, affects first the relative economic opportunities for men and women, and in turns, if there is an effect on relative economic opportunities for men and women, if this has an effect on family decisions or family behavior. In this sense, we also think that our work contributes to the literature on the role played by the gender wage gap in affecting the relative marriage market value of men and women, and consequently family formation. Of course, this literature has very deep roots, both in sociology and in economics. With the idea, especially like thinking of Becker, the idea that a decreased gender gap decreases also the value for women of getting married, the option of getting married, because decreases the amount of specializations also within the household, and the gains of getting married. More recent work on the decline in the relative marriage value, especially of men, is both from the economics and the more the demography sociology literature. So Watson and McLanahan find that half of the marriage gap between high and low income men is determined by relative income rather than absolute income. So it's not a matter really of how in absolute terms like men earn, but it's a matter there is a relationship between the relative income of men and women and the probability of getting married. Kearney and Wilson find a positive shock to the income of low-skilled men due to the coal boom in the Appalachian region, and find that this positive shock to the income of low-skilled men has led to higher fertility. And then other works has focused on again on the effect of improvements in men's labor market conditions on fertility. And what they find is that an improvement in the condition of the labor market, in the condition on the labor market of men, is linked with an increase in fertility, while the opposite is true for women. And then finally, if you want, like a very related work to ours is the one by Otter et al. And so they focus on the import competition, so on the effect of international trade and globalization on males' earnings, and in turn on marriage and fertility. And so what they find is that men in areas that were particularly shocked by import competition from China reduced their earnings, and also their marriage and marital fertility, but they also serve at the same time an increase of in out-of-wedlock fertility, which is also something that we find in our work. Finally, the third important literature that we look at to frame our work is the one on economic uncertainty and fertility. So there is plenty of work on the effect of recessions and rising unemployment rates by many authors, including Anna, who focuses on the effect of the last recession. And so the idea is that similar to economic recession is that by decreasing employment and wage prospects of current workers, robotization may increase economic uncertainty. Okay, but so you might wonder then, okay, but so how is this research question different from the general research on increased unemployment, right? Is just automation another way of increasing unemployment? And so at the end, this is just another paper on the effects of unemployment on fertility and family behavior. While we don't think that is that has to be the case, it is unclear a priori whether the effect of robots on fertility should be comparable to those of economic recessions for one specific reason. Okay, so recessions are cyclical, and we know from the demographic literature that with the cyclical type of recessions, individuals tend to react in the short run, but by reducing fertility, but there is also a recuperation effect once the cycle turns positive again at the end of recession. So there is postponement and recuperation. In the case of robots are likely to change the economic prospects of the affected workers permanently for the future. It's really hard for workers who lose their job because of automation to retrain or get into education to be able to be more complement of automation. And so we think that the effect of automation might be even more important than the standard recession in the long run. Might be more similar in the short run, but in the long run might be more negative. And of course, like, I don't know what's your format, but if you have questions, please, I'm happy to take questions also on the go. So I'm willing to do that. So the analysis, the empirical analysis, is focused on American community survey data, which is a nationwide US survey conducted every year by US Census Bureau. The advantages is that it's a really large sample sizes, and as a consequence, there is information at the granular geographical level, which allows us to calculate the exposure to automation at a very precise geographical level or very small geographical level. What is the other advantage of ACS is that since 2005, there are specific questions that allow us to track fertility behavior and marital behavior, of course, other than labor market outcome. In particular, since 2005, there is a question about having had a kid in the previous year. So like all women are asked whether they had a kid, a child in the previous year with respect to when they were serving. So this allows us to build good measures of fertility in a very representative sample for the entire US population. Technically, we restrict our sample to individuals aged 16 to 50. And we aggregate all data at the commuting zone and year level. Okay, commuting zone is a statistical unit that is used often by labor economists in the US, which tries to classify counties or section of counties into areas that are characterized by very intense daily commute. So these are areas that represent, if you want, local labor markets. Within a commuting zone, people move a lot to go to work. So people don't exactly live where they work, especially in the US. There's a lot of commuting. And so you want to consider as a unit, not just a county, which is an administrative type of unit, but you want to consider a local labor market. This is what the commuting zone does. And so at the end of the day, our analysis focuses on 741 commuting zones that covered the entire US territory over the period 2005 and 2016. In terms of robots or automation, the data that we are using is our data from the International Federation of Robotics. You probably, since you're interested in these topics, you might already be super familiar with them. But quickly, it's just the association of all the producers of robots. It's an association that represents more than 90% of all industrial robot production. And so a survey asks every year these producers where they sell their robots, in what industry and what country every year. So we managed to get information for each country and each given industry classification, although the classifications, the industry classifications is very granular within manufacturing. Of course, manufacturing is the sector that buys most of these robots, while it is more coarse in other sectors. What do we mean for robot in this empirical context? Well, the Industrial Federation of Robotics defines a robot, a fully autonomous machine that needs to be automatically controlled without a human operator. And very importantly, these machines need to be able to be reprogrammed to perform new tasks. Okay, so it's not a piece of machinery that just can just do one task in a production plan, but these machines can be reprogrammed for new tasks. Okay, just to give you an idea in terms of the adoption of robotics, in terms of quantity, starting from 2005, which is our period, the amount of robots that were installed per 1,000 workers in the US went up from around 1.3 to almost 2.4, so almost doubled in this period, with a more, if you want, exponential type of adoption after the Great Recession. In terms of estimation, we follow pretty much what has been done in other papers, in particular in Acemoglu and Restrepo paper. And so we estimate this model. So we have a panel of commuting zones and year, and we have a family or labor market outcome. We have a measure of exposure to robots that I'm going to describe in a second. And then we control for average age and average share of women every year in the commuting zone, just to make sure that differences or changes in fertility is not driven by changes in the composition of these commuting zones and demographic composition of these commuting zones. We have year fixed effects and commuting zone fixed effects to take into account unobserved characteristics, unobserved differences across commuting zones. Our measure of US of exposure to robots in the US is a so-called Bartik instrument. So the idea is that we focus on, we take the share of employment in each industry I for each commuting zone C at the beginning of the automation wave. So automation started, so if you look at this data, there are almost no robots before the year 1990. So taking the employment, the industrial composition of each commuting zone in 1990 means like looking at pre-automation type of industry specialization of each commuting zone. So mechanically, the idea is that we take the robots adoption, so how many robots have been installed in the US, not in one specific commuting zone, because we do not have information for each commuting zone. We only have the breakdown of robot data for each industry. So what we can do is like apply the adoption of the trend in the adoption of robots by industry to each county, to each commuting zone, according to the industrial composition at the beginning of the period. And so we technically, I mean, or in practice, what we do is we multiply the share of employment in industry I of commuting zone C with the amount of robots installed in the same industry, but in the entire US. Okay, so the idea is that commuting zones that were initially specialized in industries that later on adopted more automation or installed more robots, those regions are the ones that are going to be most shocked by the adoption of robots.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Why do you use T-2 and not T-1 or T-3?
Thank you. I forgot to specify this. Yeah, we think this is the thing that makes more sense for two reasons. Like first, in order to observe effect on fertility, we need to wait at least 9 months or 1 year. So you need 1 year to observe a reaction of individuals. And second, the ACS doesn't ask you if you had a child this year, but the ACS only asks you if you had a child last year. So for this reason, we thought T-2 is makes the most sense. But yeah, thanks for letting me clarify that. That was important. In terms of variation that we are using, this is pretty much a picture of the variation we are using. As you can see, once you collapse this interaction between the share, the employment share of each industry times the national trend in that industry, and then sum all these interactions up for a commuting zone, you have areas that are way more shocked or way more exposed than other areas, the lighter areas. Okay, so darker areas in this map are areas that were in 1990 specialized in sectors that were later on very much automated for technological reasons, because it was easier to adopt or to automatize production in those industries. So one concern, econometric concern, is that using the US trend in the usage of robots in each industry might be endogenous, because it might be there might be third variables or unobservable trends that both are affecting the adoption of robots and fertility. Okay, so for instance, if there is already a demographic trend that decreases the amount of young workers on the labor market because of migration or other reasons, or change the composition, that might affect both how the firms react to that demographic change, and at the same time that will change fertility. So to address this concern, what we do is like we replace in this part of the of our measure of exposure, we replace the trend in industry I for the US, with the trend in robot adoption in the same industry, but in European countries, okay, in particular in these European countries. And the idea is that using the adoption of in another continent in the same industry will give us information about the technological frontier, how the technological frontier is changing, and so it's going to be less endogenous to what's happening to the actual labor market in the US, and it's going to reflect more just the fact that certain industries are more easily automatized, no matter the local condition. Okay, and then to avoid mechanical correlation with initial shares, we take initial shares in 1970 to instrument for shares in 1990 that we have seen in the, if you want, in the baseline model. Okay, then technicality, we use the 30th percentile of robot usage in the European countries, just because empirically, if you see descriptively, especially because of Germany, Europe tends to adopt and install way more robots than the US. And so the trends in quantitative terms of the US is more similar to the trends of in the 30th percentile of the European distribution. So this is the first stage graphically of our robot exposure measure with the US data relative to our IV. So on the x-axis, you have the robot exposure measure with the European data. Okay, and as you can see, it's the correlation is very strong, and the first stage F statistics is pretty high. So we are not concerned about a weak instrument problems. At this point, I want to just show you the main results. Okay, and then I will later discuss the mechanism. So what we find, so for each set of results, you can find the OLS specification, which is the one with the robot exposure measure with the US trend and 1990 shares, a reduced form, which is simply replacing the US-based exposure measure with the European-based exposure measure, and then a two-stage square in which we instrument the US exposure with the European exposure. And so what we find is like a negative, not really significant effect on marriage, but especially we find a positive and large effect on divorce, and a positive effect and large effect on cohabitation. Just to give you an idea of how large these effects are, well, a 1 standard deviation of robot exposure, which is almost 2 robots per 1,000 workers, decreases the probability of being married by 0.5%, and the probability of being divorced by 9%, and the probability of cohabitating by 10%. Okay, this is by looking at these estimates relative to the mean, relative to the mean for these variables. So overall, negative effect on marriage, not really statistically significant, a positive effect on divorce, and a positive effect on cohabitation. When it comes to fertility, we find overall actually no effect on total fertility. Okay, so we were puzzled because there was so many things changing in the decision about marriage and cohabitations and family formation. So we were a bit surprised about the zero effect. But then when we then unpacked the effect between marital fertility and out-of-wedlock fertility, we saw that the null effect was actually the result of two very important effects. So it's a 12% decrease in marital fertility and a 15% increase in out-of-wedlock fertility. So two very large effects that compensate exactly. So if you just look at fertility overall, it seems like you risk to overlook potential important effects on fertility, which are actually pretty consistent with the effects on family behavior. So why do we think, or why these effects make sense? Well, we think that already before starting looking at this research question, like we always thought of automation as something that is not going to be a gender neutral type of technology on the labor market, in the sense that it's clear that robots are way more likely to substitute workers in industries such as the manufacturing industries, which are really male intense. Okay, and instead, automation has been shown to expand employment in sectors that are way more gender neutral, from managing to general service industry. So you have a potential negative strong effect on blue collar male workers, and a potentially positive effect for all other jobs that tend to be far less male intensive. If this is the case, then robots might decrease the relative economic value of men. Okay, and if you want, they might seriously endanger the role of the breadwinner men with stable, relatively well-paid and protected jobs in the manufacturing sectors that have characterized the post-war economies worldwide, but especially the US one. So we test these hypotheses looking at specific outcome, economic outcome. We look at income, labor force participation, and employment for men and women separately. And also we look at the gender gap and how automation affects the gender gap in these specific outcomes or variables on the labor market. So what we find is that when looking at income, we find a negative, small, not significant effect on the income of women of automation, but a much larger negative effect and significant on male, which in turn reduces substantially the gender income gap, okay, by 4.2% on average in areas that have a 1 standard deviation increase in robot exposure. So the gender gap in income gap decreases substantially because of robot exposure. When it comes to labor force participation, we find an actual positive effect on the employment of female or women, and no effect on the labor force participation of men, which in turn still reduce the gender gap in employment, in labor force participation. For what concerns employment, actually we find for this period, so this is like 2005 to 2016, so a period which is later than the previous studies, such as Asimov and Restrepo study. And so focusing on this period, we actually find a positive effect of robot exposure on overall employment, which is slightly larger for women than for men, but overall is positive for all. Okay, so it seemed like in this later year there was recuperation in terms of employment. However, the very negative effect on income tells you a story about automation destroying good, well-paid jobs, and the economy creating new service jobs that tend to be low skill and less paid, and probably with more discontinuous careers, etc. So maybe more employment overall, but substantially less well-paid. And with a reduced income gender gap. So overall, we think that these effects on the on gender gaps is might be the main mechanism for our effects, for the effects that we find on fertility and marriage and divorce. And just to have a sanity check, what we do is, using the same data, we look at the income gaps. We look at the effect of the income gaps of the income gaps, the gender gaps in income, labor force participation, and employment on marriage, divorce, cohabitation, and fertility. And so what we find is that, as we expect, like increasing gender ratio will, in these economic outcomes in our data, will increase marriage, decrease divorce, and also increase marital fertility and decrease out-of-wedlock fertility. So since all the effects we find are reducing, are about a reduction of the gender gaps, what we find is consistent with also the relationship that we find in the data between the gender gaps and family behavior and fertility behavior. I had 40 minutes, right? Like, so time is...
Oh, don't worry, you can take longer. We don't have anyway time until 2:30 for a discussion, so it's okay.
Okay, but I think, like, so what the rest of the paper is just like showing you robustness checks, but so the idea is that we want to double check that our exposure to automation is not picking up like pre-existing trends. So a placebo test that you want to do is like looking at whether our exposure to automation can predict trends that happened before automation. So between 1980 and 1990. And so if that was the case, that would be a problem. But we don't find this effect. We also, if one is concerned about the fact that all the effects that we find is driven by one specific sector, by the trend in one specific sector, and so the fact that the automotive sector is just like in decline overall, and so what we are picking up is just that. Well, we can control for specific time trends based on only the share of employment in the automotive sector at the beginning of the period. So to exclude the possibility that all the effects that we find is driven by these trends, and we find that that is not the case. Finally, we also restrict the analysis to individuals who did not move or did not migrate in the previous year, so did not change the place of residence. This is not the perfect way to controlling for immigration in this context, but it's the only way given the data to do this. And again, we find consistent results. So just for the sake of time at this point, I'm happy to talk about these robustness checks, but for the sake of time, I just like conclude at this point. We find evidence that robust exposures leads to a reduction in marriage and marital fertility, and an increase in cohabitation, divorce, and out-of-wedlock fertility. We find that among the most important mechanisms, there is the impact on the gender gap, on the income gender gap, which has reduced the relative income of men relative to women, and in terms has probably decreased the marriage value of men in these labor markets. Okay, and so this is the main mechanism. In terms of policy implication, we think that given this large impact on cohabitation and the recent evidence in the sociology literature about the fact that cohabitation may reduce children's well-being, well, then probably policy implication of these changes is not really much about overall fertility, which we have seen is not really affected negatively overall, but is affected in this composition. So given strong increase of fertility in cohabitation settings, policies that help sustain the well-being of children in this more fragile environment might be important in areas that were most affected by automation.